The crowd had gathered before dawn, which was the custom, because waiting was its own kind of pleasure when the thing being waited for was a man's death. Cecily Vale arrived last, at the precise moment when arriving later would have been conspicuous, and she stood at the outer ring of bodies, with her hood drawn and her hands folded inside her cloak, where no one could see them shake. Thomas Merritt stood on the platform above her. He was 22 years old. He had worked 6 years in the Ashby household stabling horses and carrying coal, and in 18 months of imprisonment, he had grown thin in a way that made his youth more visible rather than less, as though the flesh had retreated to reveal the boy underneath. He did not look frightened. He looked finished, which was worse. Cecily had told herself many things across those 18 months. She had told herself she did not know, at first, that Thomas would be accused. That was true, and it had stopped being sufficient within a week. She had told herself she had no proof that would be believed, that a companion girl with a disgraced father and no station would not be heard against Lady Ashby's word. That was also true, and it had stopped being sufficient the morning Thomas was sentenced. She had told herself she would find another way. There was no other way. The magistrate stood to one side of the platform. She had seen him only twice before, both times at a distance. Edward Calder, the Earl of Dunmore, who had presided at the original inquest and signed the committal with a hand, witnesses said, that did not waver. He was tall and held himself with the specific stillness of a man who had long ago decided that composure was something he owed the proceedings rather than a quality he possessed. His face in the early light was difficult to read. He wore a dark greatcoat with no ornament, and he was watching the platform with the patient attention of a man performing a duty he did not find simple, which was the first thing about him that surprised her. Cecily moved through the crowd. She was careful, and she was afraid. And she had stopped sleeping 6 nights ago when she had finally understood that Thomas was going to hang and that the only person who could prevent it was standing in this field at 8 o'clock on a November morning with her hands shaking inside a wool cloak. She reached the magistrate. His gaze came to her, not surprised, not unsurprised, simply present. She said quietly enough that only he could hear it. "He is innocent. I did it. I will swear to it before any court you name." If you have stayed long enough to hear that, if something in those words makes you want to know what she had done and what it cost her to say it, then this story is for you. Stay close. The autumn of 1817 had not been kind to Cecily, but then no autumn had been kind to Cecily since she was 19 years old, and her father's apothecary shop in Marlborough had been struck by the twin catastrophes of a single false prescription and a creditor with no patience for explanations. Edmund Vale had not poisoned his patient deliberately, and the court had not found him guilty of anything more than a compounding error. But the machinery of ruin does not require a verdict. By the time the inquest concluded, the shop was gone, the customers were gone, the house above the shop was gone, and the quiet understanding Cecily had carried since childhood, that her father's hands and her father's knowledge were the solid ground beneath everything, had gone with them. She had found the position with Mrs. Dorothea Ware through a mutual acquaintance in Bath, and Mrs. Ware was not a cruel employer. She was exacting, and she was observant, and she expected punctuality in a way that suggested she had once been failed by it in a matter of some consequence. But she did not speak to Cecily as though Cecily were furniture, which was more than could be said for 2 of the 3 households Cecily had considered before her. The work was managing correspondence, reading aloud in the evenings, accompanying Mrs. Ware to assemblies when her lumbago permitted, and performing, in general, the invisible labor of making a widow's household feel less like a place someone had died in. It was not the life she had expected, and it was not the life she had wanted. and she was competent at it in the way that people who have lost the life they expected become competent at whatever presents itself next. It was Mrs. Ware's friendship with Lady Ashby that had placed Cecily, 8 months into her employment, at a dinner at Ashby Park in the 3rd week of March. Lord Ashby was then alive, though not agreeably so. He was a man of 61 years, whose good humor had departed along with his health, leaving behind a residue of small tyrannies directed at anyone within arm's reach. At dinner, he had insulted his steward, spoken over his wife 4 times, and reached across the table to take wine from a footman's tray in a way that suggested he had forgotten the footman was a person. The room endured him with the practiced patience of people who had been enduring him for years. Cecily had been seated near enough to overhear the conversation he conducted in a lowered voice with a man she later learned was his solicitor, Mr. Pratt, a thin gentleman in an old-fashioned coat who wrote in a small leather book while Lord Ashby spoke. The details arranged themselves in her mind with an apothecary's daughter's precision. Lord Ashby intended to use a debt ledger he held over Edmund Vale to compel certain favors from the apothecary's connections in Bristol, a physician who occasionally filled Vale's orders, 2 servants in a Bristol household connected by family to her father, people with small livelihoods and no means to resist. The debt was real. The leverage was real. Lord Ashby discussed these people's potential ruin in the same tone he used to discuss the claret, which was a tone of mild dissatisfaction that expected no argument and anticipated no refusal. She had not planned it. She wished, in the months that followed, that she could say she had deliberated carefully and acted from principle, because principle would have been cleaner. The truth was simpler and more shameful. She had acted from rage and from the specific efficiency of someone who had grown up measuring powders, and from the fact that Lord Ashby's glass had been left unattended for 4 minutes while the company moved to the sitting room, and that she had in her reticule the small blue glass bottle she carried from habit, from her father's shop, from the years when she had believed knowledge was a form of safety. She had added enough to make him ill, not to kill him. She had not intended to kill him. Her hands had not shaken when she did it, which was the detail she returned to most often in the months that followed, because she could not decide what it said about her that her hands had been steady. Lord Ashby died 3 days later of what the physician called a cardiac event, complicated by what the physician described as a period of gastric distress in the preceding days. It was possible the cardiac event was entirely unrelated to what Cecily had done. It was also possible that it was not. The physician's uncertainty was recorded and set aside. The household had noted, in the confusion following the death, that a vial was missing from Lord Ashby's study. He kept a small collection of medicinal preparations, and a footman reported seeing a groom, Thomas, in the corridor outside the study earlier that evening. Thomas had been there because an upstairs maid had passed along Lady Ashby's message, asking for someone to carry a note to the steward. The maid had not remembered the details with any consistency when questioned. The steward had been out. Thomas had waited at the study door, found no one, and left. He had no means to prove any of this, and no patron who might have proved it for him. The inquest moved with the brisk efficiency of a system that had found its answer and wished to confirm it. Thomas had no counsel and no alibi that could be independently verified, and the Earl of Dunmore had presided with the grave attention of a man who believed that careful procedure was the same thing as justice, which it is when the evidence is correct, and which it catastrophically is not when the evidence is missing a piece. Cecily had watched it from a distance, then from a closer distance, then from the distance of a courtroom bench where she sat in the back row for 2 days of testimony and said nothing. She had heard Thomas speak in his own defense in a voice that was level and specific, and entirely without the theatrics that might have made him more sympathetic to the room, because he was a groom's son and had been raised to speak plainly, and the room did not know what to do with plainness, when plainness came from a man of his station. She had gone home to Mrs. Ware's house each evening and sat in the dark of her small room with the blue glass bottle on the table in front of her, and she had told herself the things she has already told you. The morning after Thomas was sentenced to hang, she had written a letter to her father in Marlborough. She had not told him what she had done. She had written that she was well, that Mrs. Ware was a fair employer, that the weather in Bath was turning cold, that she hoped his cough was improving. She had sealed it and given it to the footman and gone to her work, and felt for the first time in her life that she was not her father's daughter in any sense she could be proud of. The hanging had been set for the 12th of November. By the 5th, she had stopped sleeping. By the 9th, she had stopped eating in any organized way. By the 11th, she had written 3 letters she had not sent, each one addressed to a different official, and each one, upon rereading, insufficient to prevent the execution without a full account, and each full account, upon reflection, a document that named her own part in Lord Ashby's death and placed her in the same position she was attempting to remove Thomas from. She had burned them in the grate and sat until the ash was cold. It is a particular kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like nothing. Cecily Vale on the morning of the 12th looked like a woman attending a public event she had not expected to enjoy. Her cloak was plain dark wool. Her hood was up against a cold that had, in fact, nothing to do with why her hood was up. She had walked the 4 miles from Mrs. Ware's house rather than take the chair, because she had needed the time, and the walking had not resolved anything but had at least organized her body into a forward momentum that felt like intention. She arrived at the outer edge of the crowd at 10 minutes past 7, and she had stood there for 53 minutes with the blue glass bottle inside her cloak pocket, where her fingers found it without her choosing to reach for it. She reached the Earl of Dunmore at 8 o'clock and 4 minutes. He did not dismiss her. That was the first thing she noticed, and she catalogued it with the same precision she applied to everything, because that was the only tool she had. She had expected him to dismiss her the way men of his station dismissed companion girls with claims at inconvenient moments, with a slight turning of the body and a word to a clerk. He did not turn his body. He did not call for a clerk. He looked at her with eyes the color of winter stone and said, at the same low register in which she had addressed him, "Tell me the specific thing you did." She told him. She did not soften it, and she did not apologize in the middle of it. Because apology in the middle of a true account is a way of making the account about the teller's feelings rather than the facts. And the facts were what Thomas needed. She used the correct vocabulary because her father's daughter could not have done otherwise, and she watched his face for the reaction she had been bracing for across the preceding 6 nights, and did not, quite, find it. He listened without any alteration in his expression that she could identify, which was alarming in one direction and steadying in another. "The vial," he said when she had finished. "I have it." She produced the small blue glass bottle from inside her cloak. He took it from her without touching her hand, held it to the light for a long moment with the focused consideration of a man reading evidence rather than performing attention, and then turned to the nearest uniformed officer with a single short instruction that she did not hear because the crowd behind her had shifted and the noise rose briefly. The hanging did not proceed at 8 o'clock. This should be the moment she felt relief. She did not feel relief. She felt the specific sensation of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped knowing it was there, shifting without quite releasing, the way a door settles in its frame during a change in weather, but does not open. She felt the cold. She felt the hard ground under her feet. She felt the eyes of several people near her, curious and speculative. and she pulled her hood further forward and waited. There was a great deal of procedural business over the following 4 hours. Cecily sat in an antechamber in the county building on a wooden bench with a window that gave onto a gray courtyard, and she answered questions from 3 different officials and 1 solicitor. And she answered them the same way each time, because she had decided in the 53 minutes at the edge of the crowd that she would answer everything and lie about nothing. Not because she was confident this would protect her, but because it was the only version of herself she could arrive at the other side of and still recognize. The solicitor, a Mr. Carrington, referred to her twice in the course of taking her statement as the companion girl, in the tone of a man who has a phrase that means something smaller than a name, and has used it so often it no longer occurs to him to choose a different one. He said it to a colleague, not directly to Cecily, as though she were present in the room in a different capacity than the one being recorded. Lady Ashby was present for part of the proceedings. She sat across a wide table from Cecily in the formal session, and Cecily observed her with the care that the situation seemed to warrant. Lady Ashby was a woman of perhaps 50 years, handsome in the manner of someone who had been regularly told so and had organized certain habits accordingly. And she sat with a composed attention that held, underneath its surface, a quality of displacement that suggested the morning was not proceeding as she had arranged herself to experience it. She had reported what she believed. She had believed it with the confidence of a woman for whom social position had generally meant her beliefs were confirmed rather than questioned, and the composure she was maintaining now was the composure of someone actively composing herself rather than someone who possessed it naturally. The Earl of Dunmore came to Cecily in the antechamber at noon. He had conducted himself through the morning's proceedings with a quiet efficiency that made the process feel intentional rather than mechanical, and she had watched him from across rooms whenever she could do so, without being observed doing so. He did not sit when he came to her. He stood at the window, which gave onto a courtyard where a bare tree was doing nothing in particular in the cold light, and he said, without preamble, "The coroner's record is ambiguous. The physician's testimony at the original inquest named natural causes. The substance you administered was not, in your father's professional judgment, sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in a man of ordinary health, though Lord Ashby was not a man of ordinary health. And that complicates the picture considerably." Cecily said, "I know what I did." He turned from the window then. He was close enough for her to see that the stillness she had read as coldness was not coldness. It was the disciplined immobility of a man who had trained himself out of whatever he used to do with his face at difficult moments, and that the training had a visible cost. He had the kind of face that kept its own counsel and expected the same of the people it turned toward. "So do I," he said. "You prevented a blackmail scheme that would have harmed at least 4 people, one of them your father. You did it clumsily, and without considering the consequences, and you have spent 18 months living inside those consequences without speaking. You are also the only person who can set Thomas free. He will be free," she said, "whatever happens to me." He looked at her for a moment that was slightly too long to be procedural. She was aware of her own pulse in her throat, which she attributed to the morning's events and the cold room and nothing else. "Yes," he said. "He will." The formal hearing took place 2 days later. Cecily attended with a solicitor provided by a charitable institution Mrs. Ware had quietly contacted, because Mrs. Ware, who noticed everything, had noticed that her companion had not slept in 9 days and had drawn her own efficient conclusions without being asked to draw them. Mrs. Ware did not express sentiment openly, but she had pressed Cecily's hand before she left the house on the morning of the hearing, and the pressure had been brief and firm, and had said everything that would have sounded wrong if it were said aloud. The hearing room was not a courtroom, but resembled one in the way that county administrative buildings in that period resembled the functions they housed without quite achieving them. The ceiling was low, and the light came from windows on the north side that did not catch the December sun. Cecily sat at a table to the left with her solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Holt, who had read her account with the attentiveness of someone finding it more complicated than expected, and had thereafter addressed her with more respect than she had anticipated. The Earl of Dunmore presided from a chair at the head of the room that functioned as a bench, without being formally labeled one. He arranged his papers before the session opened with the unhurried precision of a man who finds order genuinely calming rather than merely strategic. The solicitor, Mr. Carrington, read Cecily's account into the formal record in a dry voice that drained it of the 18 months it had cost her to produce. He referred to her, early in the reading, as the companion girl again. He said it in passing, as a gloss on an identifying phrase, and the syllables fell into the quiet of the room without, apparently, any awareness of what they contained. The Earl of Dunmore said, his voice level and unhurried, "Her name is Miss Vale." Mr. Carrington looked up briefly, nodded without expression, and continued. He did not use the phrase again. "If there is a part of you that knows what it is to be reduced to a category, to be the companion girl or the apothecary's daughter or the woman whose father had a difficulty attached to his name, stay with her now. Because what came next was not what she expected. She had expected to be charged. She had spent 2 days calculating the terms of her own jeopardy. And she had arrived at the hearing with a clear account of what she had done, and a clear willingness to give it. And the shape she had imagined was the shape of an exchange. Thomas's freedom for her own. She sat in her chair with this understanding arranged inside her, and she found it acceptable, which was the truest measure of how much she had changed across the 18 months. Thomas was present in the gallery under the custody of an officer. He was thinner than he had been on the platform, and he sat with his hands on his knees, and he watched the proceedings with the expression of someone who had long ago learned not to arrange his expectations. He was, Cecily observed, 22 years old, and had the bearing, already, of a man considerably older, and this, too, was something she had done. At the conclusion of the account, at the point where the magistrate was to issue a formal ruling, the Earl of Dunmore set down his pen and looked across the room. Not at Cecily, not at Lady Ashby, not at Mr. Carrington, but at the officer standing beside Thomas. He said the words, level and deliberate. "This woman's testimony overturns the verdict. Thomas Merritt is free." 12 words. She counted them later, in the way she counted things when she needed to make an event real, by reducing it to its components. The room absorbed the silence that follows a thing that has finally happened. Thomas looked at Cecily across the gallery. He did not smile. He exhaled, slowly, as though he had been holding a specific breath for 18 months. The Earl of Dunmore came to her in the hall outside the hearing room afterward, in the narrow space between the 2 doors where she had stopped, because she did not know which direction to walk. And he said, "The coroner's inquest is being formally reopened. The physician has been recalled. The question of whether Lord Ashby died of natural causes or of something complicated by what you administered is a medical question that has not been properly answered. And until it is, the proceedings against you remain open." "I understand," she said. "I want to be clear," he said. He paused, and she recognized the quality of the pause. It was the pause of a man who had decided something, and was now saying it. "You have behaved with considerable courage. You have also behaved, at the beginning of this, with significant recklessness. Both of those things are true. The law does not sort them neatly." "I did not expect it to." He said, "No? I did not think you did." She was aware of him the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room, not with any particular analysis, simply with the body's knowledge that there is warmth at a certain distance. She did not permit herself to think about the fact that he had corrected the solicitor. She had a father in Marlborough who did not yet know what she had done, and a position she had likely lost, and a legal proceeding that was not closed. This was not the moment for anything except what was directly in front of her. "Go home," he said. "Not as a command, because you have not slept, and it shows, and there is nothing you can do here today that will be better done today than tomorrow." She said, "Thank you, my lord," and walked toward the left door, and she felt his attention on her back briefly before the door closed between them, which was a thing she noticed and did not examine until much later. She wrote her father that evening. She told him everything. She did not spare herself in the telling because she did not think she deserved to be spared, and she did not soften the part about what she had done for the same reason. She sealed the letter at midnight and sat with it in her hands for a long time before she gave it to the footman in the morning. The coroner's inquest took 11 days. The recalled physician's testimony was considerably more careful than his first, which is a reliable outcome when a physician is made to sit with his original notes for a fortnight and ask to account for each one of them publicly. He confirmed that the substance Cecily had identified was consistent with residue found in the glass, that the quantity she described was not, in his professional opinion, sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in a healthy constitution, and that Lord Ashby's constitution had been, by the physician's own records, not healthy for several years. The cardiac event, the physician testified, was most consistent with natural causes materially advanced by several years of significant personal excess and a period of acute gastric distress. The inquest concluded accordingly. Cecily received the news in Mrs. Ware's sitting room, where Mrs. Ware sat with needlework she had not been doing, and an expression of composed attention that indicated she had been watching the door for some time. Cecily read the letter twice, set it on the table, and sat in the particular quiet of a verdict that does not undo what was done, but does significantly alter what comes next. Mrs. Ware said, "Well, the inquest found natural causes," Cecily said. "The proceedings against me are closed." Mrs. Ware set down the needlework without ceremony. "Good," she said. "I imagine you will need to write Lord Dunmore." "I had thought to call," Cecily said, and then stopped, because calling on an earl was not a thing a lady's companion did, and the conventions of the situation had not, whatever Mrs. Ware's implication, rearranged themselves simply because the inquest was concluded. "In your particular situation," Mrs. Ware said, "I suspect the usual order of the conventions may not be the operative question." She was not wrong, and she knew she was not wrong, and Cecily knew she was not wrong. And this understanding sat in the room between them for a moment, before Cecily chose the letter. It was brief, correctly formal, and said what it needed to say and nothing that it did not. She read it back and found it said nothing she actually meant to say, which was the appropriate outcome for a letter written between formal parties in a formal situation, and she sent it anyway. The Earl of Dunmore called on Mrs. Ware 3 days later. He was shown into the drawing room at 3:15, and Cecily was present because Mrs. Ware had asked her to be present and had not needed to explain why. He accepted tea, which he did not drink. He sat, which was the first time she had seen him seated, and the change of posture altered something about him that she could not precisely name, not the stillness, which remained, but the quality of it, which had moved from official to personal, in a manner that the chair seemed to have produced simply by existing. He addressed Mrs. Ware correctly, and Mrs. Ware addressed him correctly, and this continued for 4 minutes before Mrs. Ware set down her own teacup and said, without any alteration in expression, "I believe I need to speak with my housekeeper. Pray excuse me." She left with the efficiency of a woman who has arranged a thing and intends to give it room. The fire crackled once. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that struck the side of the undrunk teacup and the edge of the mantelpiece, and nothing else in the room with any particular force. "Your father's debt," he said. "The ledger Lord Ashby held. I have spoken with the estate solicitor. The original sum was not large. The interest compounded through 18 months of unresolved proceedings was substantial. I have arranged for the ledger to be surrendered to your father and the debt formally forgiven as part of the estate settlement." She said, "That was not your responsibility." "No," he said. "It was not." She looked at her hands. She looked at the fire. She did not look at him because she was performing a small private act of discipline that she thought she owed the situation. "My wife died in the winter of 1812, he said. She looked at him then. "She was traveling at my insistence. I had business in Edinburgh that I had decided was pressing, and I had decided the weather would hold, and I was wrong on the second point, and possibly wrong on the first." He was looking at the fire in the way that people look at fires when they are looking at something else entirely. The physician said afterward that she had been unwell before we departed, that the cold alone was not the cause, that her constitution had been less sound than either of us had known. I spent some years after that trying to determine whether I had not known because I had not looked, or because she had not wished me to see, and I have not resolved it. A pause. What I have resolved is that I presided over Thomas's inquest as a man who had decided to trust evidence over perception, because perception had already cost me more than I could afford to lose again. I was thorough, and I was wrong. The evidence I had was incomplete because the person who held the missing piece was in the back of the room and chose not to speak. Cecily said, "I am sorry for what it cost you." He turned from the fire, "As I am sorry for what your silence cost him. And you." She looked at him across the afternoon drawing room, with its fire and its undrunk tea and its winter light on the mantelpiece, and she thought about the quality of a courage that does not look like courage from inside it, that feels, from the inside, only like being unable to continue the alternative. "A beginning," she said, "would require a great deal of honesty. I have found I am better at honesty than I used to be," he said, "when there is someone specific to be honest with." His hands were very still on his knees. They were being held still rather than being naturally still, and she noticed this because she noticed hands, because she had grown up in a shop where hands were the instruments of everything, and their quality under pressure was the thing her father had taught her to read first. She said, "My prospects are not what a man of your station would ordinarily consider." He said, "My station does not limit my perception of your worth, Miss Vale. It only makes it clearer to me which of us is being offered the better part of the arrangement." She did not permit herself to smile. She came very close to it, which was the closest she had come in longer than she could accurately measure. The weeks that followed were not simple, because the right things rarely present themselves without complication, and this one required a series of conversations that each had to be conducted in the appropriate order for the conventions of the period to be satisfied. Mrs. Ware was brisk and warm in the way of women who save their warmth for moments when it can be practically directed. She expressed her satisfaction with the situation in a single sentence. "You were always worth considerably more than the position, and I am glad someone with the authority to say so has said it." Edmund received the news of his daughter's engagement in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday and produced, by his own account in his reply, a period of silence lasting most of the following day. The reply itself ran to 4 pages and was more carefully written than anything he had produced since his shop was still open, and Cecily read it twice and understood that he had written it at least 3 times before committing to the version she held. He had written, on the 3rd page, "I raised you to know that a thing rightly done in the wrong moment is still rightly done. You should have spoken sooner. You know that. So do I. I am also grateful you spoke at all." She wrote back at once and told him she would see him in January. Lady Ashby called in December. She sat in Mrs. Ware's front sitting room with a composure that Cecily found harder to read than it had been in the hearing room, and after a silence that was long enough to be honest, she said, "I reported what I saw and believed. I was confident in my account." She paused. "I have been considering whether confidence and accuracy are as reliably connected as I had supposed." Cecily said, "I should have spoken in time to prevent the trial. I was afraid. You were not wrong to report what you observed." Lady Ashby looked at her for a moment. "No," she said at last. "Yet I might have looked more carefully at what I did not observe." She set down her teacup. "I hope your situation going forward is a better one." "I hope the same for you," Cecily said, and meant it, which surprised her slightly, and perhaps Lady Ashby as well, because something shifted briefly in her expression, before it composed itself again. Thomas sent a letter in the 2nd week of December, in a careful hand that Cecily had not known to expect from him, because she had not thought to ask whether he could write, and this omission told her something about her own assumptions that she spent some time with afterward. The letter thanked her. It was brief and specific, and said near the end that he did not blame her for the silence, because he thought he understood what the silence had cost her, which she suspected was more charitable than accurate, and which moved her considerably. She wrote back. She told him she was not certain thanking her was the correct posture, but that she was grateful he had survived to write the letter, and that she had thought of him daily across 18 months, and that she hoped the new position, a neighboring estate, good references, a family that had heard the account, and wished to make what amends a hiring could make, would prove a better chapter than the one that had preceded it. The ceremony in January was small by design and by preference, attended by Mrs. Ware and Edmund and the Earl of Dunmore's steward, who had been his friend for 20 years and communicated his approval through the specific relaxation of his usual formality, and by no one else, because neither of them wanted a room full of people watching the thing, which was a preference they had discovered they shared in the same conversation in which several other preferences had revealed themselves to be shared, which was a conversation that had required a great deal of honesty and had been better for it. Edmund shook Edward Calder's hand for a long time. Cecily could not hear what her father said, which was deliberate on both their parts. She watched the Earl of Dunmore listen to it with the attentiveness of a man receiving something he had not known he was missing. And she thought about her father's hands, which were still an apothecary's hands even without a shop, precise and patient and capable of weighing what they held. That evening, in the drawing room of the house she was now permitted to call her own without qualification, Cecily sat beside the fire, while her husband read at the opposite chair, and the snow outside the window performed the specific private business of snow in January, falling without urgency on the dark street. The room was warm. The fire was low and steady. She could hear the faint sound of the household settling into the night in the way that houses settle when the events of a day have finished their work. On the mantelpiece, the small blue glass bottle stood where she had placed it that morning. She had taken it out of her cloak pocket and set it on the mantelpiece deliberately, because she had decided it was the kind of thing that should stand in the light rather than be kept in the dark, because the dark was where she had kept it for 18 months, and the light was where she was living now. It caught the firelight on its curved side and held a small, warm point of it. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at the man reading across from her, the book open in his hands. The slight ease about his shoulders that had not been there in November, and that she suspected was the physical expression of a weight he had been carrying, that was not unlike her own, in character, if not in kind. And that had been beginning, slowly, to shift. She had walked through a crowd with her hands shaking and spoken the true thing, and the true thing had been costly and complicated, and had not resolved itself cleanly or without the kind of difficulty that leaves marks. It had resolved. Thomas was employed and alive. Her father's debt was gone. The proceeding was closed. The man across from her had set down his book without quite meaning to, and was looking at her in the way he looked at her when he was looking at her, and did not intend to pretend otherwise. She had not been visible for a long time. She was visible now. That was the particular kind of justice that arrives without announcement, the kind that does not restore everything that was lost, but does name what comes next, in plain terms, in a warm room, in the company of a person who looks at her and sees what is actually there. The fire settled. Outside, the snow continued its unhurried work on the dark street. The blue glass bottle held its point of firelight on the mantelpiece, and Cecily looked at it once more, and then away, toward the window, and the falling snow, and the long quiet season that was only beginning to be known. If this story stayed with you, if there is a moment in it you are still holding, I would very much like to know it. Leave a word in the comments, whatever it is you carry. Thank you for staying until the end.